She sat down across from me without being invited, and the first thing I noticed was that her hands were shaking. Not the way hands shake from cold, and not the way they shake from age. They were shaking the way a person shakes when they have been waiting for something for a long time and have finally stopped believing it will come, and then it comes anyway. But I didn't understand that yet. I didn't understand anything that night except that I was in a booth at Paulette's Diner on Barton Street East in Hamilton, Ontario, at 9:22 on a Wednesday in November, and my coffee had gone cold without my noticing, and a woman I had never seen before had just sat down across from me without asking. She set a rolled photograph on the table between us, looked at my face, and said words I will remember for the rest of my life. Before I tell you what she said, I have to tell you what kind of day had put me in that booth, because it wasn't an accident. It was the last stop on a road I had been traveling since 8 o'clock that morning, and every kilometer of that road was paved with something I had lost. 8 a.m. Tuesday, November 12, 2024. Conference room on the 14th floor of the Meridian Structural Building on King Street West, the company I had worked for 17 years. The company where I had started as a junior structural engineer at 25, worked my way up to senior project lead, and had assumed, the way you assume things that have always been true, that I would still be there in another 20 years. The man sitting across from me was named Trevor Foss. He was 36, brought in from the Toronto head office after the acquisition, and he had the expression of someone who had already delivered this news 3 times that morning and had gotten efficient at it. He said my position was being replaced, not eliminated, replaced. The firm has licensed Struct AI Pro, he said. It does in 4 hours what used to take a project lead 2 weeks. We're transitioning the full structural analysis pipeline to the platform. 17 years, I said. I know, the severance package reflects your tenure, 18 weeks pay, continuation of benefits through January, and access to our outplacement service. 18 weeks, 17 years of arriving before the crew, of reading blueprints until my eyes went blurry, of catching the kind of calculation errors that software still misses because software doesn't walk a site and feel that something is off. And Trevor Foss was compressing all of that into 18 weeks of severance pay and a phone number for a career counselor. Is there anything I can do? I asked. He said no, the decision was final. HR walked me out. I collected the things from my desk, a photo of my son Felix from a camping trip in Algonquin 2 summers ago, a conference mug from 2019, a drafting pencil I had used for 8 years, and let the HR coordinator, a kind woman named Sylvia who looked like she hated her job that morning, walk me to the elevator and wish me luck. I sat in my truck in the parking lot on King Street for 35 minutes. The November sky over Hamilton was the particular gray that comes off Lake Ontario in autumn, low and heavy, the escarpment barely visible through the cloud. I watched other people go in and out of my building. Then I drove home. Our house, Claire's and mine, was a semi-detached on Locke Street South. We had rented it together for 6 years. We had been together for 11. We had never gotten married, mostly because we kept meaning to and life kept not making room for it, until eventually it had stopped being a question we asked. Her car was in the driveway, she was home early. I found out why at 2:15 p.m. She was sitting at the kitchen table when I walked in. There was a mug in front of her, and her hands were around it, and she looked like someone who had been sitting there waiting. Not the way you wait for someone you're glad is coming home, the other kind. Lucas, she said, I need to talk to you. Claire, I got laid off this morning. Something moved across her face, not surprise, more like a timing issue, like she had planned for a slightly different sequence and had to recalibrate. I heard Meridian was restructuring, she said, I'm sorry. You heard? Priya told me, her husband does business with them. She took a breath. The kind of breath people take before they say the thing they've been rehearsing. Lucas, I've been talking to a lawyer for the past 2 months. The kitchen was very quiet. I'm leaving, she said. I've already talked to Felix. He knows. I told him last week. His things are mostly at my mother's already. You told Felix before you told me. I needed to make sure he was okay before I dealt with the rest of it. The rest of it, I repeated, that's me. She looked at me across the kitchen table, 11 years of looking at each other across that table. A kitchen we had painted together in 2019, cabinet knobs we had argued over in an IKEA in Mississauga, a window above the sink we had taped over every November because the seal had cracked and we kept meaning to fix it and never did. She looked at me across all of that and her face was the face of a stranger. Not angry, not sad, just finished. I'm done, Lucas, she said. I've been done for a while. I just needed to get my affairs in order before I said it out loud. Why, I said, what did I do? She was quiet for a moment, and then she said the thing she had clearly been rehearsing for longer than 2 months. You've never wanted more than just enough. I used to think that was peaceful. Now I think it's just standing still. You've been standing still for years, and I can't stand still next to you anymore. Just enough. I'd worked 17 years at the same company. I had shown up every day. I had never missed a mortgage payment, never left a job before today, never done anything that could be called wrong by any measurable standard. I'd been by every metric I understood, a reliable man. And the woman who had slept next to me for 11 years, who had sat in the waiting room when my son had his appendix out at Hamilton General in 2021, who I had assumed would simply always be there. She was telling me that reliability and standing still were indistinguishable from where she was standing. She stood up, said Felix's custody would go through the lawyers, carried a suitcase she had apparently already mostly packed down from our bedroom, loaded it into her car, and drove to her mother's place in Ancaster. I stood in the driveway and watched her taillights disappear down Lock Street. Then I went inside. I walked to Felix's room. His desk was still there, his school books, but the shelves were half empty, the things that were truly his, the ones that mattered. The Lego Technic set he had built over 3 weekends when he was 12, his good headphones, the jersey from his hockey team, all gone. Removed while I was at work earning the paycheck that had apparently been the only thing keeping her from leaving sooner. I sat on the edge of his bed for a long time. I'm not a man who cries easily, and I didn't cry then. I was just a man in his son's half-empty room in a house that was now a lease in his name alone, trying to understand how a day that had begun with a cup of coffee and a reasonable expectation of continuity had ended here. At 8:30 p.m. I got in my truck. I couldn't stay in the house. I drove east on Main up to King, across downtown, aimless driving, the kind that serves no function except to keep you moving when staying still feels like sinking. I saw the light from Paulette's through the window and pulled over. I had been going to Paulette's since I was in university. It was the kind of diner that had absorbed the neighborhood around it without changing, that smelled like coffee and hash browns, and something slightly burnt you could never quite identify. Doris, who usually worked Wednesdays, saw me come in and poured the coffee without asking. She set it down in front of me and said, "Rough one, sweetheart?" "Yeah," I said. She nodded like that was enough and went back to the counter. I sat in the booth by the window and watched the rain on Barton Street, and at 9:22 the door opened and an older woman came in. She was tall, thin, silver-haired, wearing a green wool coat with a canvas bag over one shoulder. She ordered tea from Doris the way you order when you know a place well, then turned to look for a seat. The diner was mostly full. Her eyes settled on the empty space across from me. She walked over. "Do you mind?" she said. "Go ahead," I said. She sat down, unwrapped her scarf, set the canvas bag beside her. Then she reached into it and pulled out a rolled tube of paper, a photocopy, old and slightly blurred, and set it on the table between us. She looked at me, not casually, carefully, like she was reading something in my face. "You look like you know what you're looking at," she said, nodding at the paper. "I'm a structural engineer," I said, then I corrected myself. I was. She looked at me a moment longer. "My name is Ruth Calloway," she said. "I'm a retired historian with the Hamilton Heritage Council, and I've been looking for someone like you for 8 months. What Ruth told me in the next hour changed the direction of everything. The old Desjardins footbridge on the western edge of the Dundas Valley had been scheduled for demolition since the spring. It was built in 1928, a pedestrian suspension bridge, small by any standard but remarkable for its era, and had been closed since 2019 after a structural assessment flagged the cables for wear. The city had decided demolition was cheaper than restoration. The Heritage Council had applied for a designation to stop it, but the application required a structural assessment proving the bridge was restorable, and for that they needed the original engineering drawings. The drawings had been lost. A fire in the Municipal Records Building in 1996 had taken them. What remained was partial, a handful of archival photographs from the 1930s, a single page of hand-drawn load calculations that had survived in a private collection, and a construction photograph taken during the bridge's installation that showed the cable anchor system in enough detail to be useful, if you knew what you were looking at. "I've been to 4 engineering firms," Ruth said. "The Heritage Foundation has a small grant, about $12,000, and every firm has told me that's not enough for even a preliminary assessment." "It might be," I said, "depending on what the photographs show." She reached into the canvas bag and pulled out a manila envelope. Inside were printouts, high-resolution scans of the archival photographs, and the partial calculation page. She slid them across the table. I looked at them. The photographs were clear enough. The construction image showed the anchor plate configuration in detail that a trained eye could work from. The calculation page was in the handwriting of someone who had learned to draw before they learned to type. Careful, precise, the kind of penmanship that no longer exists. At the bottom of the page, in smaller letters than the rest, was a name. V. Hargreaves, P. Eng. "Who is V. Hargreaves?" I asked. Ruth's expression shifted, not surprise, the look of someone who has been waiting to be asked that question. That, she said, is the real reason I need to save this bridge. Her name was Vera Hargreaves. She had graduated from the University of Toronto School of Engineering in 1921, one of 3 women in her class, the only one who finished. She had worked for the City of Hamilton's Infrastructure Department from 1923, initially as a draftswoman, then in roles that required an engineer's judgment, even when they didn't carry an engineer's title. The Desjardins footbridge was, according to Ruth's research, almost certainly her design. The load calculations were in her hand. The surviving design notes referenced her modifications, and a 1929 internal city memo in the provincial archives referred to Miss Hargreaves' bridge with enough casual specificity to be conclusive. Her name did not appear on the bridge's official dedication plaque. It did not appear in the city's historical engineering register. A man named Robert Coulter, who had been the department supervisor, was listed as the responsible engineer of record. He had signed the permits. She had done the work. I looked at the photograph of the bridge, a pedestrian suspension span maybe 40 meters across, crossing a ravine in the Dundas Valley, small, old, the cables slightly rusted, the deck boards long since replaced, the anchors embedded in limestone abutments that had not moved in 96 years. A woman built this in 1928 and no one put her name on it. I can assess the photographs, I said. I can reconstruct the structural logic from the calculation fragment and the images. I can't guarantee what the assessment will conclude, but I can tell you what's there. That's all I need, Ruth said. Whatever the work pays, I'll pay it from the grant. I did the math in my head. My severance would carry me about 4 months if I was careful. Claire and I would work out the rental through the lawyers. Felix's support would be a separate conversation. I had no job and no immediate prospects, and a set of skills that a software platform was now theoretically performing, and no one in Hamilton apparently needed at the moment. Except for one 71-year-old retired historian with $12,000 and a bridge that belonged to a woman whose name had been written in someone else's handwriting for almost a century. I'll start Monday, I said. Ruth looked at me for a long moment. Thank you, she said. Whatever brought you here tonight, I'm glad it did. I had nowhere else to be, I said. Neither did Vera Hargreaves, she said, and look what she built. I moved my things to my brother Cameron's place in Stony Creek the following week. My brother is 3 years younger than me and has the particular gift of knowing when not to ask questions. He gave me the spare room, left a 6-pack in the fridge, and did not mention Claire or the job once in the first week, which is the most useful thing a person can do for someone in my situation. I sat up at his kitchen table and started working. The photographs Ruth had were better than I expected. The archival shots showed the bridge from 3 angles, and the construction image gave me the anchor plate geometry in enough detail to reverse engineer the cable tension design. The calculation fragment confirmed the load assumptions. Vera Hargreaves had designed for a pedestrian load of 4.8 kilopascals at a time when the standard was 3.5. She had built in margin that the bridge was still living inside 96 years later, even with the cable wear. The cables needed replacement. The deck needed work. The abutments, I was almost certain, were sound limestone anchors at that depth in the Dundas Valley don't shift. I put together a preliminary assessment in 2 weeks, restorable, structurally viable for another 60 years with the right work. Ruth took it to the Heritage Council. They took it to City Council. City Council, to the surprise of everyone involved, said yes. In the meantime, Ruth and I filed a supplementary submission to the Heritage designation, a documented case for recognizing Vera Hargreaves as the bridge's engineer of record. We had the memo from the provincial archives. We had the calculation page in her handwriting. We submitted it in January. The designation was approved in February, both of them, the bridge and the name. Felix came to visit every other weekend starting in December. He was quiet the first time, the way a 16-year-old is quiet when he doesn't know how to be somewhere that isn't home. He sat in my brother's living room, watched television, ate the pizza I ordered, went to bed without saying much. The second visit he asked what I was working on. I showed him the photographs, the drawings, the calculation fragment in Vera Hargreaves' handwriting. She was an engineer in 1928, he said. One of the only licensed women engineers in the province, I said. He looked at the photograph of the bridge for a long time. He had his mother's eyes and my jawline, and the particular expression teenagers have when something is actually landing, which they will not let you see them register, because that would be giving something away. That's kind of wild, he said. Yeah. And nobody knew it was her. Almost nobody. Ruth knew, now the city knows, and they're going to put her name where it was always supposed to be. He nodded. He went back to his pizza. But when he asked, on the last morning of that visit, whether he could come to whatever ceremony happened when the bridge was done, asking the way you ask when you might care but want to leave room to find out, I said yes without making anything of it. The ceremony was on a Saturday in early March. The escarpment had a thin coat of snow that hadn't melted, and the Dundas Valley below the bridge was gray-brown with the last of the winter. About 40 people came, Ruth's colleagues from the Heritage Council, a few city councilors, a journalist from The Spectator, and 2 elderly women who turned out to be distant relatives of Vera Hargreaves that Ruth had located through months of careful research. The city installed a new plaque on the bridge's east abutment. It read, Desjardins Footbridge, constructed 1928, designed by Vera Hargreaves, P.N. 1897-1974, recognized as a Hamilton Heritage Structure, February 2025. One of the relatives cried, the other held her hand. My son Felix stood next to me. He had come from his mother's place in Ancaster on the bus, which was the most independently motivated thing he had done in months. He wore a coat that was not warm enough for a March morning on the escarpment, because that is what 16-year-old boys do, and I gave him my scarf without making a thing of it, and he took it without making a thing of it, which is how we have always communicated best. She'd have been happy about this, he said, looking at the plaque. I think so. Do you think she knew when she was building it that she wasn't going to get credit? I thought about it. I think she probably suspected. And she built it anyway. And she built it anyway, I said. He was quiet for a moment, then that's kind of what you did. I didn't answer right away. I stood on the limestone abutment above the Dundas Valley with my son beside me and Ruth Calloway talking to the journalist nearby, and Vera Hargreaves' name cut into new stone below us, and I let the thing my son had just said exist without immediately doing anything to it. It's April now, 17 weeks since the worst morning of my career and the worst afternoon of my life, and I live in a rented apartment on James Street North, a 1-bedroom with a decent view of the escarpment on clear days, and I don't have a permanent job yet, but I have something else. I have work that means something. Ruth and I have formed a partnership. She has a list of 6 more heritage structures in the Hamilton area with compromised or missing engineering documentation, and I have the skills to reconstruct what's missing, and the Heritage Foundation has indicated it will fund the next project before this one is even fully settled. Claire has her apartment in Ancaster. She seems, from the small amount I see of her at pickups and drop-offs, to be fine. I don't wish her poorly. I did not earn the words she said to me, "You've been standing still, and just enough isn't enough." But I understand now that the words, wrong as they were as weapons, were pointing at something real. I had been in the same job, the same house, the same life for so long that I had confused continuity with contentment. I had stopped asking what I was building toward. What I am building toward now is a bridge with a woman's name on it, and then the next one, and whatever comes after that. Ruth told me once on a drive back from a site visit in Flamborough that Vera Hargreaves had spent her whole career watching her name be left off things, reports, memos, plaques. She had written to the Engineering Association twice in the 1950s, asking to have her contributions formally recognized, and been politely ignored both times. She had retired in 1962 and died in 1974 with no official acknowledgement of what she had built. She knew, Ruth said. I'm certain she knew, and she kept working. Why? I asked. Ruth thought about it. Because the work mattered regardless of who got credit, and because there is a particular kind of satisfaction in building something that outlasts the people who underestimated you. I think about that when I'm at my table on James Street North, with the photograph of Felix from Algonquin on my shelf and the calculation fragment from Vera Hargreaves' hand framed on the wall, Ruth's idea and the right call, and the escarpment visible through the window on the clear days. Standing still is a choice about what you've decided isn't worth moving toward. I spent 17 years not making that choice consciously. I thought I was being steady, I thought I was being reliable, and maybe I was in the ways that don't show on a person until the things holding them in place are suddenly gone. But what I've learned in these 4 months, what Ruth Calloway gave me by sitting down in a booth I hadn't offered her and setting a rolled photograph on the table between us, is that being good at something and being recognized for it are 2 completely different things. And when the recognition disappears, the skill doesn't go with it. It's still there, it was always there. It just needed someone to sit down and ask. If there's someone in your life who has told you that just enough isn't enough, that you've been standing still, that you peaked somewhere before now, that you don't have more in you, I want you to hear this. Sometimes the people closest to you have been looking at you for so long that they can't see you anymore. Sometimes it takes a stranger. Sometimes it takes a woman in a green wool coat at 9:22 on the worst night of your life, who sets a photograph on the table and says 4 words that land somewhere in your chest and don't leave. If this story hit something in you, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear that their worst day might be the night before the right person walks in. Drop a comment. I read everyone. I'll see you in the next one.